everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome again. My name is Jessica, and I'm the program coordinator for Greensboro Bound. Today is the third of our three-part Crimson Letters series. We're here again with Tessie Castillo, who is the author of Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, and we are joined by our special guest, Robert Bobby Brown, who is joining us. And then at about 4:30, we're going to have Tessie's Tessie's co-host, George Wilkerson, will call in. And just to remind you that George is only allowed about 15 minutes at a time. So the call will end and then we'll have to get him back on the line. So there'll be a little bit of a delay there, but we should be able to kind of keep the conversation going. I'll also ask everyone, if you have your cameras on, if you would please turn them off. And if you have your microphones, which you shouldn't, but if you do have your microphone on, if you will turn that off as well, that's just to avoid any visual distractions for our guest here. So let's go ahead and get started. So our topic for today is racial justice and defunding the police, what it is and isn't. The Minneapolis City Council recently announced its intention to defund and dismantle the police department. Other cities have announced plans to defund the police. What does this mean when we say defunding the police? What are the potential benefits and drawbacks? How might defunding the police fit into the goals of broader racial justice reform across the U.S.? We're going to discuss the potential benefits and drawbacks of this, as well as why racial justice is a necessary precursor to any type of criminal justice reform. Lastly, we're also going to set out a blueprint for what people of all backgrounds can do to raise consciousness and support for anti-racism efforts. So a little bit later in our conversation, we will take questions from our guest. If you would direct those to me, Greensboro Bound, in the chat box, then I will read those and direct those back to Tessie, Bobby, and you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions of George once he's on the line. And I just want to ask you again, if your cameras are on, if you would please turn them off. Please turn your cameras off and we'll go ahead and begin. Okay, so once again, Tessie is with us. So Tessie, for those who may be joining for the first time, can you just give us a little bit of a background of yourself just tell us a little bit about your background and how you first became interested in death penalty reform.
Sure. I actually got involved in death penalty stuff by accident. I had met someone at a Super Bowl party who happened to be a psychologist who worked at Central Prison, which is where all of the people who have death sentences in North Carolina, all of the men, are housed. And I asked to get involved in the prison. I wanted to volunteer as a writer to teach writing and journaling classes to guys who were on death row. And I was able to do that. That was back in 2014. And after a few months of just meeting different guys who are on death row in North Carolina and witnessing just the incredible levels of insight and often humility that I found on death row, I wrote a letter to the News Observer, the local paper, basically advocating for the humanity of people on death row. And for that, I was kicked out of the prison and my class was canceled. And I'm actually banned from, I think, all the prisons in North Carolina. So I started writing to the men who had formerly been my students, and we started this really great correspondence, letters on faith and family and freedom and all kinds of different topics. And after a while, I proposed publishing a book with a few of them, a compilation of the letters and essays that they had written. And in March 2020, we published the book, which is called Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row. Took us 4 years to write. It was really hard, but I'm so glad that we got it done and that we put it out at in such a timely place right now where we're talking about these issues of criminal justice and racial justice issues. These are all themes that come up a lot in the book. So I'm really happy to be here.
Okay. Thank you, Tessie. All right, so now I keep wanting to call you Dr. Brown, but you said Bobby, so Bobby. Bobby is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Criminal Justice at North Carolina Central University. And so we're very thankful for him and the expertise and knowledge that he brings to our conversation today. So I pose the same question to you, Bobby. Give us a little bit about your background, and we'll go from there.
Oh, thank you. And again, and anyone later on in this conversation for asking questions, please just call me Bobby. We're not in a class. There's no red pen involved here. It's not about a Dr. Brown type of thing. It's about all of us sharing and learning together to have hopefully a better understanding of issues related to criminal justice and related things going on in our society. While most people would recognize me professionally as a policing scholar, I ended up getting a PhD in criminal justice with a specialization in policing. My career actually started out with a focus on corrections, particularly in individuals who were incarcerated and trying to find ways to get them back into the community. After I got my master's degree, which happened to be a specialization in corrections, I worked for a nonprofit organization in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of DC, called the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives. And for that organization, I used to do what is called client-specific planning or mitigation work. I was a case manager, mitigation specialist. I used to do parole plans for prisoners, community-based sentencing plans, treatment plans, and death penalty mitigation. So going back to the mid-90s, I used to actively work to try to facilitate conversion of death penalty sentences to getting them commuted to being life sentences, and in some cases trying to help people get exonerated. I did that for about 3 years, and working so closely with incarcerated individuals and trying to get them back into the community, working very closely with our court system and seeing how things were playing out, it hit me that something or someone like me needed to also be involved on the front end. I found a lot of reward in helping people on the back end of the system try to get out of the system and stay out of the system. But over time, it occurred to me that there were not many people who looked like me and who had my perspective working on the front end of the justice process. And when I was at the University of Cincinnati, I happened to have the opportunity to work on a project that involved systematic social observations of the police. Graduate students and researchers rode around with police officers in the front of the car, right next to them, taking detailed notes on all of their behaviors, their interactions with people. And to make that long story short, that started me on the path to becoming a policing scholar. And unfortunately, there are not many Blacks or Black American males who are formally trained in the study of the police. There are many people who are in the social sciences, who work in law enforcement, who are minorities. But when it comes to choosing a path of studying the police, becoming immersed in the literature on policing, the research on policing, and working directly with agencies as a scholar, as an academic, there are unfortunately too few Black Americans and Black American males choosing that path. And I've decided to walk that path.
Thank you, and I apologize for the whatever that was. Thank you so much. So,
No problem.
Kind of a segue from that, and Tessie, I'll come back to you in just a second, but since Bobby just kind of leads us here. So from that background and that entree kind of being kind of an anomaly in the study of this field, what most interest and excites you about the work that you do?
As an undergrad, I was a political science pre-law major, and I had the infamous law school dreams. Washington, D.C. is home for me. I wanted to be a lawyer. My mother was a legal secretary. Her work world was always around lawyers and such. I believed in what was on television like so many other people, and I had a passion for trying to be about justice and bringing forward justice. As a young man, I grew up actually disliking the police very much. I was the quintessential angry young Black male, with authority figure issues, and everything from my interest in the Black Panther Party to seeing myself in all of the negative things going on in policing. Every time that there was some major controversy involving the police and a person of color, in particular a minority male, I saw myself. And for as long as I can remember, I felt it imperative that I be a part of the solution, that something had to change because it could be me one day. What I find fascinating about it today is that right now, while there is a great deal of attention to this, I'm also vexed. By this, I mean attention to police minority community relations. There's an increased attention, and I'd say positive attention to folks feeling like something has to change. I'm still personally vexed because, and this goes back to the call me Bobby. When I go out to the store later this evening on the grocery run for the family, I could get stopped and I'm just going to be Bobby. I might not even be in the eyes of the person stopping me. I might not even have the status in that person's eyes as Mr. Brown. I'm just going to be, I could be stopped by someone who would treat me in the most negative ways that we've seen. And I might not be able to do something about it in that moment in time. I think about that, and I think about my son. I think about my daughter. I think about my relatives, my friends. So I'm intrigued by it. I'm still on that wheel because it's my life.
Yeah, and I would say you're not alone in those feelings, and that's I mean, that's why we're having these conversations. But you're not alone in those feelings that you could see yourself in all of those acts, and that, you know, when you do go out, you are Bobby, you know. And so, I mean, I appreciate where you're at and how that has led you to where you are now and the work that you do. I want to direct that question back to Tessie, the same question, and I know obviously her path and her background will be a little bit different. But Tessie, I actually don't think I've ever asked you this, but I know that you what got you started on this path was your journaling class. How did that start? And then kind of segue from there, basically, why did you want to have a journaling class? And from there, what most interests and excites you about the work that you're doing now? And let me unmute you. There you go. Hang on, you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself? There we go. All right, go ahead.
I actually have the opposite background from Bobby. I grew up in New Hampshire, where I hardly ever saw a Black person or any person of color until I left New Hampshire, which was during college. So I grew up very sheltered, very unaware on a lot of levels of what was happening, particularly in the criminal justice system. I definitely saw racism as something that certain bad people did, but something that I would never do and that my family would never do. So I grew up with a lot of those preconceptions. And I got into criminal justice work by accident also. I think all the good things in my life have happened by accident. I don't know if I can say this because it's not on Zoom, but I was a starving artist a few years ago, and I was looking for just a paycheck, and I found this really interesting job description on Craigslist. They were looking for someone who spoke Spanish, who would take a large rubber vagina out to the Home Depot and do sex ed with the farm workers who were behind the Home Depot waiting for jobs. And so I took that job and I started doing that. And it turns out that this organization did more than just sex ed. They also did education on drugs, such as overdose prevention education and HIV prevention education. And from there, I learned about drugs and the incredibly harmful ways in which we handle the issue of drug use in our society. And then that got into criminal justice, which gets into racial justice. And so I sort of went about it that way. And at each level, when all of these, different things were uncovered to me, I just had these moments of being completely flabbergasted at the system and how it works and how pervasive the injustices are, the racial injustices and the class injustices. And I continue to be amazed even today. I feel like I shouldn't be amazed anymore, but I still have those moments sometimes where I'm just like, wow, do we really live in a society like this? And that made me interested in the work and has kept me engaged throughout many, many years, and I hope for the rest of my life. And I guess what most interests me in the work is learning how these injustices are not just things that are happening to other people or that are being committed by other people, but that I commit in the way that I vote, in the way that I handle myself when I'm around police or when I'm around communities that may be heavily policed, communities of color. So just that whole learning curve where figuring out how the different ways in which I conduct myself as a privileged person, as a white person, contribute to that problem is sobering, but it also means that I can contribute to the solution. And so I want to focus on that moving forward and try to be part of addressing the issues that I have been a part of causing.
You guys met about, I guess, 5 years ago, working to implement the law enforcement diversion program with the Fayetteville Police Department. Can you tell me about your involvement with that program, including any successes and challenges that you witnessed or experienced? And I'll take this back to Bobby first, and then Tessie, over to you.
Sure. That is how I was fortunate enough to meet Tessie, doing some work with the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. I was a professor at Fayetteville State University, and I do see one of my colleagues in the room here. Good to see you, Zara, at Fayetteville State. One of the great things about Fayetteville State University and really the city of Fayetteville, the police department there, and I would say the criminal justice agencies there as a whole, they are very open and very willing to innovate, to try to do things differently. As former Chief Bergamine, who created a position for me to be an academic advisor, a formal academic advisor to the police department there, as one of the things that he was well known for saying, we can't arrest our way out of crime. And that is consistent with 21st century policing. That is consistent with where progressive police departments are today. They're not just saying and openly recognizing that this cycle of arrest is not going to improve things. They're actually trying to engage in practices to change the way justice is done. And they decided to try what at the time was still a very new strategy called law enforcement assisted diversion. Part of my background is in drug courts and veterans treatment courts, and many people are probably aware that our system does in some ways try to divert people or attempts to provide treatment to people once they get into the system. Very interesting things we can discuss about how well that treatment is provided and how that works. But LEAD, law enforcement assisted diversion, attempts to keep some people from even entering the system. It's a pre-arrest diversion or deflection approach, recognizing that from a harm reduction perspective, which is very, very different for law enforcement to embrace, recognizing that some issues and some people should not really be handled by the justice system. If a law enforcement officer could see Bobby and recognize that Bobby has an addiction issue, and that's Bobby's real offense. Bobby's not committing crimes other than possession, use of drugs, or Bobby's only committing minor crimes. Let's try to find a way to use community resources to get Bobby the treatment and the services that he needs so that he will no longer be involved with the system. And whether you have jurisdictions that are embracing LEAD because they see human beings, they see Bobby, and they want to facilitate that change for Bobby, to, oh, you have agencies that come to the conclusion, if we spend less time responding to the calls for the Bobbies, that might save us money. Either way, it ends up being a strategy that's trying to keep more people from entering the system and getting them away from the system early on. Tessie, do you want to jump in on any of that?
Well, that's a good description of it. I think that some of the successes of that program is they were able in a lot of different communities, especially in Seattle where the program actually started. You saw the recidivism rate among the people who participated in that program go down really significantly. And you saw more people enrolled in things like housing and treatment programs if they needed drug treatment. Whereas before they had just been cycled in and out of the jail. And you also saw some attitudes change within the police department where they were able to see the benefits of actually addressing the root cause of why people were engaging in small crimes. And so that was something that was really heartening. Some of the challenges that I think a lot of the programs ran into was actually around racial justice, because it was a totally voluntary program. So police, at the point of arrest, they would choose, oh, do I want to arrest this person like I normally would, or do I want to divert them to these social programs? And you did see people of color being often arrested as usual, and white people being more often diverted into these programs. So that was one of the challenges that we ran into in all the programs, because they've been implemented in several cities now. And another one was just having police as the point of contact, the point of entry into social services or into drug treatment, period. Just having them have to be there, because those interactions with the police often, especially with people of color, especially with Black members of the community, were so tense to begin with, that even to interact with a police officer with all of the emotions and everything that can happen, often it just wouldn't, like, that was where the point of friction was. And as long as that needed to happen for them to get into the social services, it was problematic.
And I would like to add to that, Fayetteville's approach was a little different than most other deflection diversion programs, in that at the start of the program, Fayetteville attempted to also divert sex workers. So not just individuals with substance abuse issues, but they also attempted to divert individuals involved in sex work. Whereas most of the diversion deflection programs that we're seeing, they are focusing on they are definitely a response to the opioid crisis. They're definitely recognizing that we need to approach substance use differently, and therefore the population that they're encountering who might be suffering from opioid addictions, we need to treat them differently. And to add to what Tessie was saying, where it becomes really challenging, if a police officer in a jurisdiction that has such a program, if a police officer's outlook on Bobby as opposed to Tessie, if the conversation doesn't even start from a, hey, what's going on with you, Bobby? If it starts with a, what are you doing? Show me your ID. If it starts from an adversarial perspective, or from a view that Bobby is somehow more criminal and not deserving of treatment, that opportunity to get into a program that's available may be less likely to happen. And this cuts to some things that I think we're likely to talk about later on in this, whether some people want to use the term prejudice, racism, implicit bias. While we have opportunities or programs like LEAD and Diversion that can be really great, they can also end up not working well if you do not have the right people as the point of contact, like what Tessie was saying. If the person at the point of contact does not have the right orientation or skill set, the right outlook, the diversion, the treatment process is less likely to happen. Furthermore, if the community members do not have trust in the police, why would I want to go to a police officer to say I need help with my illegal drug habit? So this is part of a larger web of issues. We can have very innovative and potentially positive programs, but if we are not implementing them the right way, and by the right way, meaning should the police be involved with it at all? Two, if they are involved in it, how are they doing it? These are some of the things that we need to think about a lot.
That's a good segue into the next question, which is within the conversations talking about racial disparities, and how discussion of those disparities and how people of color are addressed and handled when they are stopped and all of this. So how is it handled or not by other groups involved with the reform? And then do you think that the reforms that were implemented were done so in a way that would increase or decrease the racial disparities in arrests and convictions? So that's kind of a two-parter. Like, how is it handled? And then do you think that the things that were implemented addressed it adequately? And that's to you, Bobby.
So to make sure I understand the question correctly, have the reforms that we've seen in recent years in policing or criminal justice, have they reduced disparities, or have they made things not worked at all or made things worse?
Yes, that's part two. So part one is how are the conversations on racial equity handled or not handled by police departments? So that would be phase one, like them actually trying to address the issue. And then if things were implemented, how successful or not were they?
Gotcha. So I am very fortunate to be able to say that professionally, as an academic, I have been able to work very closely with police departments. And I have been on advisory boards at the state level, county level, city level. I've worked directly with police departments. I have police chiefs that I have working relationships, dare I even say friendships with. And one of the things that I can tell you, particularly when the doors are closed, police executives for sure are very aware and can be very open that race matters when it comes to what's happening in policing. Especially those who could be labeled 21st century police chiefs, they get it in the sense that it's not just about crime stats. They have an understanding of the underlying causes of crime, and that one racial group is not more criminogenic than another group. They are challenged with, one, trying to solve some of those problems, trying to address some of those problems. Two, and this is not trying to give any police executive a pass. You have individuals who work in organizations that they don't agree with, that it can be very hard to turn the ship, the proverbial ship, as sharply as it needs to turn, as quickly as it needs to turn. We are seeing more and more chiefs be outspoken about issues of race. Today, you're seeing some chiefs come right out and say Black Lives Matter, and they will stand or kneel with community members, and that causes some internal strife. Often it does. I think that, like many of us, when we are challenged to have conversations about race and justice and equity and such, they have those hard conversations too, or those conversations are hard and challenging to have as well. And unfortunately, on the business side, some people inside of policing, while they know the problems exist, they know who some of the problematic people are in their own organization. Labor laws, unions, it is not easy to just go, hey, Bobby Brown over there, yeah, he's got some views that are not aligned with where we want this organization to be, but he's not done anything on paper where we can move him to a different place. So I think that police departments do get it. It's just challenging sometimes for them to bring about that change. Without a doubt, there are police departments that are led by individuals or dominated by individuals who do not get it. That's a different type of problem. Those types of agencies, and I think where our conversation will go later today, you can put duct tape on something that's broken, and it can be new duct tape. It can be a strong piece of duct tape, a shiny piece of duct tape, and it can be your reform. It can be your patch. But patching up something that's broken oftentimes just means you've added something else on that might stick for a while, but it's not really going to change that thing. And that's one of the issues that we're going to be talking about when it comes to reform. We can add on a new technique, a tactic, we can change a few things, but if we're not addressing some of the more important things, some of the more fundamental things going on in policing, it's just some duct tape or a patch on an otherwise problematic machine.
Right. All right, thank you. So George has joined us. I'm gonna mute him. George, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got Tessie, who you know, and Dr. Robert Brown, who prefers to be called Bobby, so we're going to call him Bobby. Just want you to let you know who's here with us. So
Okay.
Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with writing Crimson Letters.
Okay. My name is George Wilkerson, and I am a writer who's relatively new to writing, and I am a prisoner on death row in North Carolina and one of the co-authors of Crimson Letters. But keep a long story short, the way that I got involved with Crimson Letters is through a mutual friend of Tessie's. Tessie used to teach a workshop, a writing workshop here on death row. And although I didn't participate in her workshop, I heard a lot of good things about it. And so I actually had put out feelers to see if I could join the class. And so I asked one of the guys who was in her class if he would ask Tessie if I could join, and she sent word back that I could, and then the following week she got kicked out of the prison. She got banned from being able to come in again because of an article that she wrote, and that was published in the Raleigh News and Observer. So I actually missed out on that opportunity. But I think a little bit shortly after that, maybe a few months later, one of the guys was talking about a book project that they were discussing with Tessie. So there were already a number of the guys involved, 4 or 5 guys that were bouncing the idea around. And through those conversations, I was like, man, that sounds like a great opportunity. I believe in the message, this idea of changing the narrative. And what I mean by that is trying to change the stereotype of guys who are incarcerated, but more specifically, change the stereotype around men who are on death row, that stereotype, showing that we're not just worthless monsters and animals, that, people can and do change, and that we are just men like anyone else. So Tessie had that transformative experience herself where she came in with a stereotype and had her eyes open. She was disillusioned and had just those misperceptions corrected through her interactions with us and hearing our stories. And so she sort of wanted to replicate that experience with the book, Crimson Letters. And so I just, was eager to try to join that project. And she agreed, and the other guys agreed. And, it's been a long process, a years-long process, and here we are today.
Can you tell us about your neighborhood growing up? What was the police presence there, if any? And can you give some examples of your personal interactions with the police prior to incarceration? So that's kind of a 2-part. So tell us about your neighborhood growing up,
Okay.
your interactions with police
Okay.
that you had.
Okay. Okay, well, when I was 6 years old, my family's home burned down and we lost everything that we had, and so like we had to get on welfare and get Section 8 housing, and so we were thrust into the project. So my family is biracial. So my dad is white, my mom is Korean, and I have 3 brothers. And so at that age, you know, we were the first. This is back in '87. We were the first non-black family in a low-income apartment complex that had about 100 apartments, but it had probably 600 to 1,000 people housed in that little quarter-mile area. And the crime rate was just crazy. I mean, there was just crime everywhere, drugs everywhere, fighting everywhere, adults and children, break-ins, robberies. The police were ever present. I mean, they were literally just cruising the neighborhood and would chase anybody who was standing around on the corners. We frequently saw police officers, you know, just arresting guys, tackling guys, pepper spraying guys, or, you know, just throwing them into cruisers and taking them off. And so for us, the police were sort of like our enemies. They were like the boogeymen to us. You know, parents would tell us stories or say things like, all right, now, if you don't start behaving, we're going to call the police. The police going to come get you and take you to jail. And so, you know, they were the enemy to us, and I guess we were their enemies. And so it was really taboo to ever call the cops on anyone because we kind of felt like they were really oppressive in our neighborhood. So, you know, years go by, and this is just the attitude that I grew up with. And then I grew up also in a very abusive home. So when I was 12 years old, this is my personal encounter with the police. My dad had just flown off into a rage over something inconsequential. I can't even remember what it was. But he started trying to kill me. He just literally picked me up by my throat and was choking me out. And I was, you know, on the verge of passing out when my older brother intervened and attacked our dad. And I hit the ground and, you know, took off running out of the apartment, ran down to a friend's house. And I'm crying and, you know, telling his mom what happened and him. And, you know, they kind of committed a taboo and told me that I really needed to call the cops. And I was like, call the cops? You know, nobody ever calls the cops on anybody here. But they told me, you know, if I go back, my dad's going to end up killing me. I've got to do something. So I called 911. And 2 cops came within a few minutes. It was actually a black officer and a white officer. Both came up in a cruiser, and I told them my story. And they were like, all right, we're going to go up here and confront your dad with this. Because I had told them about just the years of abuse. Because my dad had been beating us probably every other day since I was 6 years old. So for the last 6 years, you know, my brothers and I had just been, you know, kept bruises on our bodies. Bones had been broken. We just were beaten frequently. But that's just how it was in that neighborhood, too. It wasn't anything unique to my family in that sense. So the officers take me in their cruiser and take me up the street to our apartment, and my dad's standing outside, and he just kind of smirks when he sees these cops and me getting out of the car with the cops. And people from the neighborhood are all standing outside watching, and they escort me up to my dad, who's standing on the stoop, and they tell him everything that I said about the years of beatings and then that night's incident with him trying to choke me out. And one of the cops had his hand on my back trying to comfort me, I guess. And my dad just looked at them and looked at me and was like, yeah, I did it. I did all of it. And the cops just, they looked at him and they looked at me and looked back at my dad, and they just pushed me back to my dad and said, well, you must have done something to deserve it. And then they just left. They didn't do anything. They didn't write my dad a ticket. They didn't arrest him. And from that night on, I just knew, it was like, well, I'm not going to get any help from them. So sometimes my dad would beat me, and or before he beat me or just after he beat me, he'd grab me by my neck or by my ear and drag me to the phone and call 911 or social services and say, here, call for help. And I would just take the phone and just click it back into the receiver because I knew that, you know, help was not going to come from that direction.
Yeah. I guess kind of segueing in that, do you think that if there had been other resources available to you, I mean, I know you just mentioned that maybe calling social services or obviously calling the police had little benefit to your situation, but do you feel like in any of those situations, if other resources had been available, and what resources do you think would have been useful to actually help you in that situation, since the police kind of were ill-equipped to deal with the situation?
Well, that particular night, I don't know, what would have actually been needed. I know that just arresting my dad, because my dad turned out to be schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic. So I know that just arresting him and putting him in jail, then him getting right back out, that would not have solved anything. Because in a way, I know that my dad had been struggling with trying not to beat us, but like he just was as much a victim of his own rage as we were, in a sense. So we kind of, although we were, experiencing the pain of it, we also kind of sympathized with my dad because he was just as helpless as we were. So I'm not sure the cops could have helped in that situation, and
You have 60 seconds remaining.
I don't know if social services would have helped, but I do think that some sort of mental health professional could have helped our dad, because he wasn't diagnosed for until like 2001. So this was 93. So he had actually started showing the signs of schizophrenia back in 87. So it took him 14 years to get.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
To get diagnosed. So I think that's something that he needed. He needed actual psychological help.
Yeah.
And there was just no help for him at that time.
Okay. So I know your time is going to be up in just a second. So I'm going to let Tessie get you back on the line. Bobby, I'm going to direct the same question to you. What types of examples would resources other than police officers, what would they, be it social workers or mental health care professionals, what types of situations would those be better resources, either in addition to the police or instead of? And you, there we go. Let me unmute you. There you go.
Sure. We have to always keep in mind that the police and criminal justice as a whole is an extension of our government. So to understand criminal justice in America, you have to understand American government. You have to understand how our system works, and how all of that filters down to the way justice is done. Part of the theme of this discussion today, or one of the questions, is defunding the police. And that is really a conversation about how, or should be a conversation about how governments utilize their resources. How much is allocated to what, and what do we expect out of those allocations? Earlier in this conversation, we talked about you cannot arrest your way out of crime. Without a doubt, many of the things that the criminal justice system as a whole responds to are the ills going on in our society. Whether, I always ask people a question: what are the things that, I'm going to use air quotes, what are the things that we believe cause crime? And when people rattle off addiction, lack of education, broken families, single parent homes, a lack of morality, mental health issues, the police, by and large, have little to do with those things. Low socioeconomic status, unemployment. The police have little to do with those things, and therefore they're not very likely to be able to solve those things. I think George is back.
Yep. Tessie, is he back? Yeah. Okay, hang on. Here we go. All right, George, are you with us? George, can you hear us? Hang on, there we go. Try again. George, are you there?
Yes.
There we go. So I'm just gonna, Bobby, we'll pause that. Some of these next questions are kind of for all three of you collectively, but I'll get to George first, since I know that his time will be up sooner. So let's see, George, having lived in a community where you said the police presence, they were there all the time. but even within that community, you said sometimes you were afraid to call the police because you on each other. But why do you think communities have evolved to so heavily rely on the police? You know, for everything, somebody's calling 911 to get the cops to come and intervene in some way. And how should we even attempt to reverse that trend at this point?
I think part of it, I think we sort of touched on it with the last question, was that it's a complex situation. A community is complex. People have complex needs, and the cops are calling 911 has been sort of like this catch-all, like this panacea. Like, oh, they're meant to solve every problem that a person could ever have, and they're just not equipped to do that. But there aren't services to address the specific needs, and I think some people don't know what it is exactly that they need. So I think some of these calls, for example, need to be filtered a little bit and then directed to the people who can actually give them the help, because the cops are not equipped to help everybody in every situation. So I think there's something, that's missing in that sense, and in terms of actually having programs or systems in place that can provide the actual help, not just in terms of filtering the help and deciding what they need, but then after what they need has been decided, giving them exactly what it is that they need. Like, for example, my dad's situation with the schizophrenia, the cops couldn't really fix that situation. They could have made it worse, but they couldn't really fix it. But, if they had been trained to identify what the situation was, maybe they could have said, hey, you know what, we're going to connect you with mental health services here in Asheville, North Carolina, and try to get you guys some help, get you some family counseling, I don't know what it is, just an evaluation or whatever, but none of that was in place back then.
To our audience, if you guys have questions, particularly for George, because he is under the clock for this, if you would go ahead and start sending those to me in the chat box. Remember, please send them to Greensboro Bound so that I'll see them. So for this next thing, I'm going to direct it to Bobby to give people just a few seconds to type their questions in. Let's see, how is the issue of racial equity tied to criminal justice reform, especially when we talk about this defunding of the police?
I think it's one of the things that I shared in my doctoral program when talking about crime and race. We have to remember that very often, very, very often in criminal justice, we are talking those little data points, the numbers that we're looking at, the stats that we're looking at, the things that people analyze when we crunch data. We are oftentimes talking about Black and brown data points. And we're talking about data points of people who are less advantaged in society. We're talking about people for whom there's a disproportionate concentration of ills, physical health ills, mental health ills, all of our negative social indicators. And there are a bunch of different reasons why that concentration of ills exists. But you cannot credibly talk about criminal justice or most things in criminal justice and ignore race, ignore class, ignore gender, and other things. So we have to genuinely embrace those things if we want to see the justice system work differently and if we want it to work equitably. And we need to think about what equitably means. It's not simply, well, everybody gets treated the same, because quiet as kept, the justice system does bad things to white folks. The justice system does not treat some people well, regardless of their skin color or their ethnicity or their socioeconomic status. I mean, we know of situations where some people, because of their status, they've received lighter punishments or lesser punishments. At times, their behaviors might even be ignored. If we really go deeper into cases and the numbers, we also know that, there are things that happen in our system that should not be happening to anyone. So I think when it comes to dealing with racial equity, we first have to recognize that race matters. Then we have to start talking about how do we want to make things more equitable and fair. Do you have a question set up for George? Okay. Let's switch to that, okay, because I can keep going.
Okay. All right. Yep. So George, this one's for you. Let's see. What would you recommend that the greatest reform for the criminal justice system be?
Are you talking about in terms of the police, or are you talking about in terms of the court, or are you talking about like in terms of conditions of confinement within the prison system itself?
I think we could talk about all three. Let's start with
oversight. How about oversight and accountability?
Okay.
I think that's something that would apply to all three fields. Is there needs to be some sort of independent oversight that oversees just policing and the prosecution of cases, and then how prisoners are treated within the prison system, and then those who are in charge of handling a person from the moment of arrest all the way up to their incarceration. They need to be held accountable for the things that they do, because I think it's a lack of accountability that just gives them the power and the freedom to do whatever it is they want, because nothing will stop them except their own moral character and humanity.
So with that, I'm going to ask you another question, kind of piggyback on that. Can you give us an example of some encounter in your life somewhere along the way where you had an encounter with police or within the system and there was no oversight or accountability, and you feel that affected kind of, I guess, maybe leading you to where you are now? If things had been different, if this instance had gone differently, is there any particular point in your life that you can pinpoint back to, like, if only that thing had gone differently with my encounter, maybe things would have been a little different?
Well, one thing I can say is my perspective has changed so much. I understand a lot more the complexity of how all this stuff works together. But at the time, that situation that I described earlier, that little anecdote about calling the cops and how, they had just pushed me back to my dad, that right there came at a time to where the previous year in school, like I was a straight A student up until the fourth grade. And in fourth grade, I made my first ever C because we were given a semester-long assignment that required us to do a series of reports and essays on a county in North Carolina, on any county of our choice. So I chose my county, and I did the work, and I, met all the requirements, except I couldn't afford the bifold cardboard display on which to hang my essays and reports. So the actual work itself I did, but I couldn't present it the way that it needed to be presented, because they were going to set all these things up in the auditorium because we just didn't have the money to buy it. And so I told my dad told the teacher, and they wouldn't make any exceptions, and they gave me an incomplete on that assignment, and it was so heavy towards my grade that it brought my A down to a C. So in terms of like how I felt towards school and authority, that kind of like just really embittered me toward teachers. And then my dad was already an authority figure that I saw how he was, and his abuse. But then on the heels of that officer encounter that I had, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of context into which that situation occurred. So on the heels of the bad teacher experience, bad school experience, bad parental experience, now the last hope for me was to have these officers, rescue me from my home situation. So at that moment, when they pushed me back to my dad, I gave up completely on all authority figures, including justice in general. Like, I just believed that there was no such thing as justice, that rules and what was right and wrong just was determined by context, just situational context. So like just that one encounter could have changed the trajectory of my life, because I just totally rejected all authority after that night.
Right. Yeah. So we have a question. We actually have a public defender in Indianapolis who is watching with us today, and they've asked, What do you think defense attorneys can do to more adequately address equality failures of the police? So the role of defense attorneys in the equity question and issue.
Well, I've had a lot of, sad to say, I've had a lot of experience with the court system and public defenders. And I understand that public defenders do not receive the type of money that they need to work. So no one can expect anyone to work for free. Now, it's nice and altruistic if people do, but, the fact is it comes down to money. And public defenders are inadequately reimbursed for their work. And so just that one factor alone causes a lot of them to hold back. They can actually help a lot of people in their cases, but because they are not going to get paid to do the work, they don't. You get what you pay for sometimes, and when it comes to legal representation, you're literally going to get what you pay for. So a public defender court record, it's not going to be as good as a lawyer who gets paid, exorbitant amounts of money to represent a client. We have a saying in here: you'll never see a rich man on death row. And it's a fact. There are no rich people here on death row.
Yeah. So, Bobby, I want to take this back to you to talk a little more about exactly what defunding the police is. That seems to be, even just saying that phrase is a trigger point for lots of folks. So can you kind of dig a little deeper into that and just go back to that and kind of expound upon it for a minute? And George's time may or may not be up while you're going, and then so we'll just carry on.
I was going to say,
I can call back if I need to.
Yeah, we'll have you call back, George. We'll have him call back, but his next round of time might be up. Yeah.
Okay.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
We have a big issue with terminology. The concerns that I've heard from my conversations with neighbors, friends, phone calls, text messages or direct messages, social media posts, it does run the gamut from abolition of police departments. There are some people who are calling for that, to defunding the police. Somewhere, I'm going to say in the middle, are concerns about are the thoughts of, well, don't we really mean reform or reinvestment or reallocation of resources? I think the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge that there are calls for all of it. There are people who are making a strong case for, we need to simply engage in some reforms to improve policing, to some people who say we need to dismantle policing as it exists and we need to create something else. I'm going to try to start at least off of defunding and reform, and then get a little bit into what abolition of the police means, or what some folks have said it means. So defunding the police is really a call for, it is arguably, a call for taking a look at policing and really taking a look at local government and recognizing that police departments get a large part of the pie. Please remember what I said earlier. Policing is an extension of government. It's a part of a city, county, state budget. And it's reasonable to think about how much of the resource pie goes to policing. And out of that piece of pie, are we getting what we want out of it? Is policing functioning the way that we want it to? And your question about, could other entities, could other agencies do what we are asking the police to do? Could they do a better job of it? Do we want the police to be involved in certain activities in the first place? And some of the clearest examples are the provision of mental health services, substance abuse services. Do we want the police to do that, particularly or social services, counseling? Do we want them to do that? Because they may not be well trained and well situated for that. Defunding the police, I encourage people to think about it in the context of how could we better reallocate the resources going on in our jurisdiction. to promote public safety and potentially help others. Reform in policing is an issue of trying to create positive change in policing, trying to change the behavior of officers or the behavior of agencies, and what are some things that we can do that would make policing more, I'm going to do another air quote, effective. Effective being lowering crime rates, effective meaning compliant with laws. I think I saw Tessie give a thumbs up that George is back.
Yep, he's back. All right. All right, George, you with us?
Yes.
All right. George, I know since we don't have a whole lot of time with you, I just want to shift gears, and we'll come back to Bobby and Tessie on the specific topics that we're talking about today. But also just want to ask you more on a personal level about your days on death row, how you spend your time, how you occupy yourself. I know that you are a writer, an award-winning writer outside, and so I assume a lot of your time is spent doing that. But other than that, kind of how do you spend your time?
Okay. Well, I am, writing is one of the activities that I do, but I would say that it doesn't really define who I am. I am a spiritual person. So the most important thing for me is growing as a human being, just spiritually in my faith as a Christian. So I do a lot of stuff, studying the scripture, reading the Bible, and putting it into practice. So everything sort of flows, even my writing and my artwork and just all my activities sort of flow from that place right there, and sort of defines my boundaries and my priorities and all that. So, I try to practice a balance of good mind and body and spiritual health. So, my days are spent trying to juggle a lot of studying and writing and exercising, and then putting into practice in terms of how I interact with everyone around me and everyone in my sphere of influence, so to speak. I just try to just live out that my spiritual beliefs. So it's different every day what that looks like exactly. But generally, I spend a lot of time. I spend my mornings doing devotions, physical exercise, trying to help the guys that are in need around me, taking opportunities like this right here to reach out beyond the walls. I spend a lot of time contemplating just social interactions and relationships in general, and sort of examining the past and how I became who I became, and just trying to chronicle my journey and trying to tie that into the meta-narrative that's sort of universal to what's happening in America and around the world in general. So that's what I do, is I try to I guess I operate on this principle that ultimately we're all the same as human beings. And so I try to examine my personal experiences and see how it actually connects and overlaps with other people's experiences. So I also do a lot of reading. I read a lot, and that sort of informs my perspectives and stuff too.
Okay. So we have a question from an audience member for you. What do you think should be done for sentencing reform and prison reform to focus on rehabilitation?
One thing I think it has to do with sentencing is removing mandatory minimums, because a mandatory minimum, it takes away hope psychologically to a person who's in prison. He's got his time. He has no incentive to behave or misbehave. He's just going to do his time, and then he'll get out at the end of his time, either better or worse. It's all, it's sort of like it predisposes a person to just be in prison. And prison is a whole other culture. But I think having hope is one of the biggest things, and what that looks like, what that translates to on a practical level is giving guys the opportunity to improve themselves. Because right now the general attitude is more punitive rather than rehabilitative. So some of those opportunities might be educational opportunities, opportunities to work some of their time off, good behavior, being rewarded for good behavior, not just punished for bad behavior. So I think that would play a huge role. I've seen that personally transform death row back in 2013. You know, and this is when Tessie got involved with the writing workshop and stuff here back in 2013, 2014. But just having access to those educational activities and opportunities just really changed the culture here on death row. It just transformed us. And, you know, being here, unless we get help from the courts, we have no reason to better ourselves except because we want to be better. You know, because we're not going to get out of prison for doing these things. We're not going to be rewarded with time off our sentence because we're sentenced to death. So even though we have that death sentence, the majority of everyone here on death row still took those opportunities to just better themselves because they just had that hope of just wanting to, you know, be a better person.
Can you speak to anything specifically, opportunities or resources that you have on death row that you've been able to take advantage of, aside from just, you know, your own efforts to, you know, your spiritual practice, writing or journaling? Are there any resources that are actually available directly to you guys and women, because there are also women on death row?
No, none.
Okay.
This right here, this phone, is the only letter writing, you know, just the opportunity to be able to interact with people in the outside world. It's the closest that anything would come to having a resource, because they are not providing anything, no classes at all. You know, we have church, but that's it.
Right.
No art classes, you know, no writing classes, none of that.
So, Tessie, I actually want to ask you a question, because I know you were kicked out as a volunteer after having the journaling program. So we know that there used to be programs and resources, and you and I had a conversation offline about even like physical, like yoga classes that practitioners are able to go into the prisons and do that. Why are there no resources anymore? Why were all of those programs stopped?
So the culture of a prison is usually determined by who the warden is. And so you'll get one warden who takes a more rehabilitative approach to running a prison, who will allow new programs to come in. So that at the time that I joined in 2013, that was a new warden, and he was ushering in all of these programs. Then there was a shift change, and the warden after that took a very punitive approach and got rid of all the programs. So there's all these cycles that prisons go through, and who's in charge is just absolutely fundamental to the culture inside the prison. And that's also true with things like sheriff's departments and district attorney's offices, who are responsible for the prosecution that occurs in a county. It's just, if a prosecutor, district attorney decides that they like the death penalty, they can pursue it for almost any first-degree murder. And if they decide that they don't, because maybe it's not politically expedient to put people on death row, or maybe they don't personally believe in the death penalty, they can choose not to put anyone on death row, even in cases of really extreme homicides. So it's really important that we as voters and as members of the community are aware of just how much power the people who we vote for have over the cultures that occur within the sheriff's department and the district attorney, because you can have night and day, and it's us who go to the ballot box and put those people in office. So it's really important that we know what kind of people we're putting in office, because someone like George and the thousands and millions of other people who are going through the criminal justice system, it matters to them so much who's in charge.
And are wardens, those are not appointed positions, correctly? That's just, you apply for the job and you interview and you get it or you don't?
They're appointed. It might vary from prison to prison. Do you know, Bobby?
They are not appointed like we would use the term for judges. They are hired, but they are a part of the administration, say in North Carolina, Department of Public Safety. So essentially the governor, essentially those who are over the Department of Public Safety and Corrections determine who's running which facilities, and who's in those positions is ultimately determined by who's running the state. Right. So Tessie is spot on, 100%. That whole criminal justice is an extension of our government. We must pay attention to who's in positions to make budgetary decisions, whether you're talking about a single correctional facility to you're talking about a police department and how things run. And ultimately, someone is accountable to an elected official, right, and therefore accountable to us.
I'm going to take it back to George. George, so I'm sure that you're aware of the Racial Justice Act and the new developments with that. Do you think that that will have an effect on your case? And how do your fellow inmates feel about what's happened recently with the Racial Justice Act?
Can you explain?
To my specific,
Can you explain this first, George, for those who don't know? Please.
Say that one more time.
Can you explain
what that is? Yeah. So
explain the Racial Justice Act?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead or do you want me to do it?
Okay, you can go ahead and do it. Okay,
so the Racial Justice Act was a 2009 act that prohibited seeking or imposing the death penalty on the basis of race. So the law was repealed in 2013, and then just recently, I guess it's been, or parts of it have been unrepealed, and that may open up possibilities for people who feel that they were placed on death row because of racial prejudice or racial issues to kind of revisit their cases. So, yeah. George, do you think it will affect your case personally, and how do your those around you, the men around you, how do they feel about this new development?
Okay, I'd like to add just a little bit more to
sure. Yeah, I was trying to give it the short. Yeah.
So one thing, just the key element.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
If race played a factor in any of the decision-making process from the moment of arrest up until the conviction, that's what it addresses. It's very broad in that regard. But yeah, because racism is so pervasive and institutional down here in the South that almost every person on death row, I think, except for 4 or 5 people, filed a claim, and I could foresee at least half getting relief under it easily.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
This has changed the whole atmosphere back here in terms of morale.
Okay.
This is his last call, so.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're having some connectivity issues.
I just want to say thank you, George, for calling in, and thank you for sharing and answering our questions. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, George. I'm so sorry that we're having some connectivity issues and we're not able to spend a little bit more time with you, but thank you so much for sharing what you did with us today.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, everybody, I apologize for that. So we're just going to pick up with that same question. If Tessie or Bobby, if you would like to explain what the Racial Justice Act is, we can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll dive back into some of our questions here that we have. Go ahead, Tessie.
So, I mean, you already explained that it was passed in 2009, and it focused a lot in particular on jury selection, because jury selection is where a lot of the racial bias happens. It's very, very common for juries to be bleached, which means that people of color are struck from juries during the selection process, and we wind up with an all-white jury. And that can have a negative effect not only on people of color who are defendants and facing potential sentences, but also on white people, because it's just shown that generally speaking, white people are more likely to convict someone and to impose harsher sentences than our people of color. So that's why so many people on death row now filed under the Racial Justice Act, including white people. So that law was passed in 2009. It was overturned in 2013, and people who had already gotten relief, there were, I believe, 4 people on death row who were taken off of death row because it was determined that they did qualify, that they had, their juries had been very racially motivated. And then after the Racial Justice Act was repealed, they were put back on death row again. So now this is an opportunity for for people to get off again. And our last special guest, the last call that we did, was Dr. Frank Baumgartner, and he's a specialist on the death penalty in North Carolina. And he said that he thinks that the death penalty as we know it may cease to exist in this state because of the Racial Justice Act, because so many of those cases will likely be overturned, and you'll see people taken off of death row. That doesn't mean they'll be let out of prison. It means they'll probably go to, can you hear me? It means they'll probably just get their sentence changed to life in prison. Bobby, you've been interrupted many times. Thank you for your patience.
No problem at all.
Our central theme, which is defunding the police. What is it? And more importantly, what is it not? And what are some of the misconceptions about it? So can you continue, and you won't get interrupted anymore this time.
Sure. Hey, there might be a Zoom bomber waiting out there. So defunding the police, I think where I ended, is I encourage people to think about that in the context of how could we reallocate resources within a city's budget to services, to activities that might be more successful or may be more likely to be successful in reaching our goals. Our goals is preventing crime, minimizing recidivism, etc. And again, social services that involve counseling, addressing addictions, that may matter a lot. I was having a conversation with some police officers. It was actually a group discussion in the last 2 weeks. And I said, you know what? While police athletic leagues can serve some important roles, do we really want the police serving as mentors or significant mentors to kids? Should that be something where where more funding is going to parks and recs? Could that be something that's funneled through our school systems operating at the county level? So as kids move from their educational day into recreational activities, could we do that instead of trying to have play in athletic leagues or some sort of activity and have some mentoring, community policing done by officers? That's some of what we need to think about. I also believe, and this is where I think we can move over from defunding and what that should make us do and reform. I've already talked about it, and others have talked about it in the sense of, should the police get the same slice of pie or size of pie, or excuse me, piece of pie, and should it be as big? Well, there's also a discussion, or should be a discussion, out of the monies that the police do receive, is this an opportunity for us to look at how they utilize those funds? And that can turn into a conversation about training, that can get into a conversation about what type of equipment is purchased. But I see this as an opportunity, and I encourage other people to see this as an opportunity for us to take a hard look at how government is done, how policing is done, and can we move some things around so that we do it better? And we have to talk about what better means. The earlier conversation about racial equity, is it about doing things to make sure that everybody is treated the same? Well, treating everybody the same is not necessarily going to produce better outcomes for some. Is it about doing something differently within policing? And as folks then move to the conversation or the concept of reform, should we invest in things like body-worn cameras to change police behavior or make policing better? Should we invest in more trainings? One of the hot buzz types of trainings that we hear about today, implicit bias training. Should we do something to change the way officers look at people and how they treat people? Should we invest in de-escalation training? As reform efforts, I think it's important for us to think about those things, but we have to keep in mind, and in these discussions, we have to keep in mind the potential limitations of several of those things. They are promising in concept, and there's some evidence that things like de-escalation training might change some behaviors when it comes to uses of force. But we actually do not have a lot of strong evidence from the criminological literature, in criminal justice literature, that de-escalation training is effective in lowering incidents of use of force, particularly problematic use of force, excessive force, deadly force. So we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to evaluate things. We do a lot of things in criminal justice, and we never take the time to look and see if they work. We especially do things that feel good, that intuitively they make sense. Body-worn cameras will create greater transparency in policing, and officers, if they know they're being watched or if their activities are recorded, they're less likely to do certain things. Well, as we're seeing today, the debate, is policing getting worse, or is it capturing what's been going on for a long time? I'm of the mind that we're seeing a lot of what's been happening for a long time. It's not a thing that policing has changed for the worse. Body-worn cameras are only as good as what we do with them as a potential reform mechanism for use of force. I'm not sure how many people on this session are aware of the footage that was just released on Monday about the Valdosta, Georgia Police Department being sued for excessive use of force. A police officer came up behind a man who was talking to another officer, and the situation was completely under control. And the officer who came up from behind him, who happened to be a sergeant, picked this gentleman up and slammed him on the ground. And it was brutal. It was terrible. And it just happened to be a Black citizen and a white police officer. Was race a part of what happened? I'm not sure. Does it matter? Probably not. Nobody should be picked up and body slammed the way that officer did it. And it was captured on 2 different body-worn cameras. And when the police department said that they reviewed the tapes administratively and nothing was done about it, what's the good of having video camera footage if when officers are found to do things that are questionable and that are wrong, they're not held accountable? So some of the things that we're looking at as possible reforms, we need to be very careful in how much faith we put into them when it comes to changing behaviors. They may just be the duct tape that I talked about earlier. If they're added on and other things are not addressed, we're just going to add new technology, new policies that do not really change the way police officers operate or the way police departments operate. So I hope that creates some clarity between what defunding is calling for and what reform efforts are calling for.
Thank you. I would add to that, based on my experiences with police reform, and I have several years of working on different reforms with different police departments in North Carolina, from law enforcement assisted diversion to helping folks get into drug treatment programs through police programs, to sending follow-up calls after someone suffers an overdose, just to check on the person and make sure that they have the services they need. And the biggest difference, I think, between reforming police and defunding police is that when you reform police, you give them more resources, you give them more training, you give them more money in an attempt to fix some of the problems that occur. And from my experience and other folks who've been working in police reform for many years, you can get some good outcomes from police reform programs, but the culture of the department fundamentally doesn't change. And often what's happening is you've got a small group within the department, and maybe the chief is one of the people who really believes in these reforms and wants to implement them, and you've got a small group who's doing it and participating, but the department as a whole retains the same mentality, which is often very punitive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about defunding police, you're giving them less resources and redirecting those resources more directly into the social services. So instead of giving the funding to the police so that they can connect people to drug treatment, you would just give it directly to drug treatment and keep the police out of it altogether. And that's really what defunding is. So it's definitely not the same thing as abolition. Some people have called for that, but that's a completely different issue. It just means taking those resources and specializing the police once again, because they're there to deal with crime and to deal with violent crime. And that's what they're trained to do. Their tools are arrest almost exclusively. And so but we've just sort of come to rely on them for absolutely everything. And every new problem, we just add more responsibilities to the police and more trainings for the police and more this and that for the police. And I think they're overwhelmed with all of it. And in many ways, ill-equipped to deal with these very, very complex problems. So that's
and to speak at least a little bit. I agree with you first and foremost, Tessie. And to speak at least a little bit to police abolition, defunding is a means to an end. You know, abolitionists, one of the tenets would be to defund the police. They should be receiving less funds. And police abolitionists want to create an environment where the police are not needed in the first place. Their end goal, or the end goal of those who argue for abolition of the police, is to set up systems and mechanisms where we really don't need the police at all. Defunding is a part of that. Empowering other entities to take on the problems that the police address, and decriminalization. Also to the point of, there's some things that the police should not be responding to from a police abolitionist perspective, because the things should not be criminal in the first place, such as drug use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually want to talk a little bit about why we have come to rely on the police so much. Like, why are they the catch-all for all of society's ills? And one perspective I'd like to share is I used to also be a lobbyist. So I worked in the state legislature, and I saw how laws are created. And one thing I saw, I think this, very naive view when I went into the legislature that bills and laws that were passed were very carefully crafted and carefully vetted, and there was this whole process to make sure that it was an appropriate law and that it would be passed. And from years of actually working at the legislature and seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak, I can assure you that is not what is happening. The legislative process is like a hurricane. It's just, there's thousands of bills, over 1,000 bills introduced every year just in North Carolina, and they're on every single possible topic that you can. And you've got legislators who are dentists, maybe, who own a woodworking company, who are expected to vote on these incredibly complex issues. They have not read the bills in the majority of the circumstances. The bills are constantly getting amended as they go through the process. There's a lot of politicking, a lot of, I'll help you pass this bill, even though it's not a good bill and I don't agree with it, as long as you help me pass this one, because this will help me get reelected. And what you wind up with a process where nobody's reading the bills, where nobody's really taking the time to look at the broader issue or to address the root cause of a lot of these complex issues, is people heavily relying on the criminal justice system to fix everything. So every time something comes up, let's say overdose crisis as a really good example, we have this overdose crisis. I think to most people, it would be very clear that that's a health issue, and it's a mental health issue, and it's an addiction health issue. It's very related to health and mental health. But at the legislature, that's a complicated problem. And so the immediate solution is always, well, let's just pass a law that criminalizes it, or that increases the penalties that are already there. And that does two things for the legislators. One, it makes it really easy. Instead of having to get into this complex, trying to actually figure out what the issue is, why are so many people dying of overdose, they can just look like they're doing something by saying, oh, we'll just increase the penalties. That keeps the voters happier. They think something's being done, and it's quick and it's easy. You can pass a bill that's just a few sentences, as opposed to many, many pages, a much more complex legislation. So they almost invariably go to the criminalizing element just because it's easier and it's faster, and they're dealing with an absolute mess of bills at the legislature, and they do not have time to deal with all of them. And the second thing that it helps with is that at the legislature, anytime you want to start a new program or fund a new program or even an existing one, you have to allocate funds. So if someone wants to invest in, let's say, drug treatment to address an issue like overdose, they have to find the money in the budget. And often that means taking money from a different program in the budget and putting it into the new treatment programs. And that creates a huge fight within the legislature and within the community over allocation of resources, like a tug of war. But if you merely pass a bill that increases penalties, that you don't have to increase the budget for it. You don't have to put that in the bill. You can just say, we're going to increase the penalty. That means more people are getting arrested, more people are going through the courts, more people are going to jail and for longer times, which absolutely costs the taxpayers more money, but you do not have to put that in the bill. You don't have to consider that at all. So even though you're also raising costs, it's like it just sort of disappears. Like the criminal justice system has an unlimited amount of money. So that also is why legislators go to that. They don't have to deal with the money issue, which is really sticky, as long as they just use criminal justice, increase the penalties as the solution to the problem. And it's also why in the community we go to police, because treatment is not free generally. So if somebody goes to a drug treatment center, they may not be able to get in because they may not have the resources, but arresting them is free. Not obviously we pay eventually as taxpayers, but no, you don't have to pay up front. And I think that's why we've come to rely on the criminal justice system so much. Is one, it's just easier than addressing the root cause of anything. And people in leadership positions under pressure want to present immediate results. And so they go to that one quickly. And two, there's this weird funding thing with criminal justice where you sort of don't have to think about how much it costs or worry about how much it costs in the same way that you would have to with every other program, literally. So that's why.
It is a government service that we cannot imagine doing without or with doing less. And it has some very interesting implications. Have you ever known, you think about many other occupations. If there's a bad year and there's a cut in the budget, what's that saying? Last hired, first fired. You think of most occupations, private or public, and when money gets tight, sometimes personnel have to go. It is extremely rare that you ever hear about a police department having to cut officers, like get rid of officers for budgetary reasons. You'll have agencies that will not get new positions. They may not backfill vacancies. They may not get their requests for new officers, but it's not an occupation where you have to worry about, oh, hey, the budget crisis is going on and they're going to go with fewer teachers, or something's going on here and we're going to have fewer nurses or fewer social workers. It's a very interesting type of job security from at the individual level to as an organization. They may not get as much money as they want. They may not get increases when they want them. But even if money is rediverted, it's not diverted in a way that it cuts their jobs.
Mhm.
That creates some very interesting working conditions and some very interesting behaviors when you have that type of job security. I really, really want to emphasize, Tessie, build on the point that I think we both made, which is more people need to pay attention to how government is working and working at their local, county, and state level. Because and I think that that's happening. What I believe is a very good thing about this, the controversy surrounding defunding, the movement, the big ball of a movement that we have right now, is we have a very heightened awareness of the need to pay attention to criminal justice. More people are paying attention to criminal justice and how things are working. They're focusing on the police right now, and what I'm excited about, for those who want to turn the page and do a little bit of looking, this conversation has been happening at the local level for quite a while. Here in Durham, there's been a strong movement of calling for defunding or reprioritizing resources. You've had changes in the composition of our city council, and some requests for new officers that in the past have been granted, they've been denied recently. And that was before what we're seeing in the last month or so related to George Floyd and protests. Quiet as kept, there has been a growing vocal movement and a lot of energy with people who are calling for, in North Carolina, justice reinvestment. One of the areas where, if you're really interested in seeing this, the offender reentry community and issue. People thinking about, hey, what are we doing when it comes to corrections? And are we doing the things that are likely to lower recidivism and restore communities? The issues of race, while policing has been to the forefront, if you really take a look at what's been going on in community-based corrections, people have been talking quite a while about issues of equity, criminalization, how we need to change things. We've seen policy changes, attempts like ban the box, trying to change the ability of people to gain employment or make it easier for people to gain employment who are justice involved individuals. We are paying attention to criminal justice, race and criminal justice in ways that we have not done for a long time. While policing is a passion for me, and I think that it's very important to pay attention to the police, because mistakes or unchecked behaviors in policing can result in a loss of life in an instant, and that's just one more reason why we should be paying great attention to the front end of criminal justice. We need to be having this conversation about our system as a whole. We need to think about the prosecutors who make decisions that might not hold police officers accountable, the prosecutors who make decisions and they change lives of the people who get processed, the judges, the correctional officials. So I really hope that as we build on this, we all move beyond our thoughts about the police and we think about good government and good administration of justice as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions along the lines of what can people do to get involved in criminal justice reform efforts locally, like particular. Can you talk about, I know you've sent me some websites and resources to check out, Bobby. Can you talk a little bit about what those resources are?
I can, but let me say I'm not a subject matter expert on grassroots advocacy. I can tell you, so things that how I've responded to this question when others have asked. I think that people need to pay attention to groups like Campaign Zero and those who are doing things basically revolving around what some may call the Black Lives Matter platform. People need to engage social media, and when there are organized protests and movements, there are groups out there that are, hey, this is going to be discussed at city council. So-and-so is speaking, the chief of police is speaking, or as we are in this, when we are in election years, hey, there's a candidate speaking. Go, show up, voice your concerns. I encourage people to do those types of things. We're in a time where, similar to what I'm going to call investigative journalism, or people trying to engage in advocacy, you have your mainstay groups, you have your ACLUs, so to speak, and NAACPs that take on these types of issues, those organizations, urban leagues. You also have people who are willing to start their own campaigns. And through social media, that's extremely easy to do. It's easy to be connected. What I encourage people is to recognize the importance of being focused. Okay. Right now, I think there's a difference between focusing on justice reform as a whole and focusing on police reform. And if you're going to take, I'm using the term reform generally, if you're going to look at, say, policing issues, you got to be wise in picking how you're attacking the issues. Remember a few years ago when it was all about, like just maybe 2 years ago even, when it was all about racially biased traffic stops? You know, the fever, the concerns were about racial profiling and traffic stops. Some recent cases have taken us now to focusing or hearing the loud voice about use of force. Has racial bias in traffic stops not disappeared as an issue? No, it's not. We need people who are advocating for change on that front, just like we need people who are advocating for change when it comes to use of force. And we need people who are advocating for treatment over punishment or criminalization, what you talked about. So I encourage people to try to search out groups that focus on what the issue is and be as laser focused as you can, instead of just being in a broad, hey, criminal justice is messed up. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, that's some things. I think we should also mention voting as a really, really huge one. And we brought this up before. A lot of times we're only focused on the presidential election or the governor's election, and we lose sight of those little elections for sheriff and for judges and for district attorneys. And those are often the most important elections because they influence the culture of the criminal justice system on a local level. And also because they're small and because not a lot of people pay attention to those elections, you actually have a real influence over them and a real voice. So pay attention to those and vote. It's important now. We had a comment from the audience to apply for absentee ballots now. We don't know what the elections are going to look like in November, or if they're going to be in person or not. So just go ahead and apply for the absentee ballot. You don't have to use it, but it would be great to have one just in case. That's really, really important.
And I 100% agree with what you're saying. And let me say this. And our educational system, K through 12, and our college system, as a criminal justice department, every criminal justice department that I've been a part of has not done as good of a job as it should in educating students about the intersection between electoral politics and criminal justice. I mean, we really need to go beyond the surface. We really need to help people understand who does what in the justice process and how that is connected, that web, how that is connected to those who are in elected offices. And I'm not talking about partisanship. I'm talking about just a fundamental, you need to understand how person X gets into this position and what this position does. And because I fundamentally believe if people understood that better, then we would see different turnouts. We would see different turnouts for prosecutors and judges. We would see police departments being managed differently through mayors or systems that use a city manager. People would view city councils differently if they had an understanding of how those entities control or influence that government service known as police or criminal justice as a whole. So I really implore everyone to be more conscious about voting in the context of criminal justice.
Do you have any advice for, because a lot of times candidates are very vague about what their issues are. They'll have like a website and they'll have either the Republican talking points or Democratic talking points, you know, very generic. Any advice for how to really dig a little bit deeper and figure out what they really think about the issues?
Gotcha. So the political scientist in me, and I'm going to hope that you're going to agree with this. If you do quality internet searches, you know, if you were directly searching voting and a person's record, voting record for person X, you can find out a candidate's voting record. So at least get a sense of their past behavior. When it comes to, say, someone who's seeking the office, so you have a new candidate and they're non-committal, they look Republicrat. You know, they're saying things where they kind of sound like a Republican, they kind of sound like a Democrat, they sound mainstreamish. There, I encourage people to think about, first and foremost, are they talking specifically about criminal justice? Are they taking a stand on any criminal justice issue? When they are taking a stand, are they focusing on a criminalization or punishment focus? Is their discussion, their rhetoric about holding people accountable? And you really, when you pay attention to it, the tone is more about holding those who commit crimes or are alleged of committing crimes more accountable? Or are they talking about things like, we need to invest in treatment and rehabilitation? That's how I try to sort through some folks. I'm going to throw this out there. Talk to most criminal justice professors that I know when it comes to crime policy. We work for free. If you email me a question, if you call me, if you come find me and you have a question about an issue, I'm more than willing to talk to you about it. In the end, it's going to be your vote. There are probably certain, particularly in public forums, I do not necessarily tell folks who I'm voting for or what do I have a particular allegiance to one candidate or one party or another. But I think that when you hear me talk, I hope it's pretty clear that I'm about rehabilitation. Criminalization is not the thing that I'm in favor of in general. I think that people need to seek, if they can't figure things out themselves, contact a subject matter expert like me or someone at one of your local universities and ask a question about the policy. At a minimum, I believe most of my colleagues in the field would give somebody, well, I might not talk to you, but I'm going to give you something to read. I'm going to guide you to something on the issue. If, for those who don't want to maybe wade out in the waters of weighing in deeply on a candidate. But people need to utilize us, criminologists, academics, as public servants.
That's actually good. That was my last question, because we're almost at 6 o'clock, was action items. Just if we could give action items, one action item to people in the audience, either to do more racial equity work or more criminal justice reform work, what would that be, action item?
Be genuine in your engagement. I see some people on here who are actually new friends of mine who I've met through some other folks. Hi, Kathleen. Who are genuinely trying to engage in these conversations in their own homes, in their own communities. there are people who logged into this because they saw the themes that we were going to talk about today. They have complicated thoughts. They're uncertain, maybe even on what they believe, but they're genuine in their desire to be here. And I think that they're going to have genuine conversations when we all leave this virtual room and continue the discussion. People need to be genuine in saying, hey, I care and I want to make a difference. Therefore, I'm going to show up for these conversations. I'm going to show up at community events in the conversations. I'm going to encourage voting and vote for myself with purpose. I think that if people genuinely engage, a lot of good things can come through. The next thing I'll say then is, yeah, actually read on the issues. Don't fall for clickbait. Do not disconnect from the issue of defunding because it sounds like getting rid of the police and that's just crazy talk. No, actually engage in the conversation and figure out what it's about. In the end, because of the way politics and policy work, it's going to fall somewhere in the middle. And the more of us who are involved in shaping where in that middle range things fall, I think the better. Because for a long time, a small group of people have been making the decisions about how our justice process works. And they've been able to do it with little accountability because for a long time, many of us have genuinely been disengaged.
I would advise people to get involved in some kind of anti-racism work. There are discussion groups and book clubs and things that are going on. There's a lot of them right now, especially with what has been happening lately, that are discussions examining the systems that we're talking about, like the criminal justice system and how it works, and understanding how many of us, and particularly white people, were brought up with sort of a blindness or a wishy-washy attitude towards criminal justice system and towards racial equity issues in general. And I think it's really important that I think when your eyes are opened on that issue, and it's not like a one-time thing, it's a lifelong process, but you can start seeing how the systems work in ways that we would never have imagined before. So I think that's really important, and I would encourage people to do that, because I often hear folks, very well-meaning, saying, oh, I want to get involved in this or that organization, and that's great. But I think if you don't consider yourself any part of the problem at all, if you just think the problem is out there and that you don't contribute to it in any way, you can't really get involved in solving it. So you need to do some of that internal work, and I think some anti-racism discussions are good for that. For example, I'm holding one. We're having a discussion on the book White Fragility starting July 12th, like a book club discussion. So anybody who's interested in that, you can email me, and we'll be talking about those themes further, and I'll send out my email. We're also doing a book club for Crimson Letters, and if you want, George will be on that book club again, and all the other 3 co-authors that we have. So at each book club discussion, there's 4. And at each discussion, one of the co-authors will call in. So you'll have an opportunity to ask them directly questions about what it's like being them, and what brought them to death row, and what is it like on death row, and what gives them hope on death row. And also, if you want any other speaking engagements, we're doing this. This is a series of discussions that we've been having, hosted by Greensboro Bound, but we're always available for others. And I've had churches reach out and universities reach out. Hey, can you talk to my class, to my students? Can you talk to our church? Can you talk to our group? We can have my co-authors call in from prison for those discussions as well, because we just really want to be having these conversations and to raise awareness about these issues. So don't hesitate to reach out and say, hey, can you guys talk about this stuff? Because we really would love to do that.
And I think that is really important, Tessie, because I've had some text messages coming through and leading up to today. COVID has made many of us step into this virtual space. I was not doing this prior to April. And since April, I've lost track of how many different things I've either been a listener to or been an active participant, been a panelist. We need to keep this going. It is great how this can bring so many people to the table, and we're not limited by geography or people's time schedules, and spreading the news about opportunities. If you're doing something, Tessie, make sure you're tagging me, because my network, I know a lot of people who want to be engaged in the things that you are talking about and presenting, and vice versa. We play a role in facilitating this dialogue and sharing of this knowledge. So, and to a point of what, if I'm hearing you correctly, there are people out there who can make requests or suggestions on what should be talked about. And there are folks out there where we'll join in. It's very easy for me to click into something for an hour versus driving to a place and set up and having to drive home. It's a lot easier to say yes to something like this than it ever was to drive across town or to another county to participate in something. So I really think that we need to keep the momentum of this going.
All right. Thank you so much. That puts us at around 6 o'clock. So if Jessica can hear me, I'll turn it back over to her to just wrap up and thank yous.
All right, thank you so much to both Tessie and Bobby for joining us today. I'm sorry that we weren't able to spend a little bit more time with George, but like Tessie said, she will be having her book club and for Crimson Letters. Also, someone had actually asked where you could read more of George's writing. So first off, if you haven't read Crimson Letters, you want to check that out. Crimson Letters, Voices from Death Row, and George does have a section of that book. Also, I will be sharing at a later point. George also has some writing online, and I can share those links through our Facebook page, as do several of the other co-authors as well. They also have other writing outside of this book. But again, thank you so much to both of you for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good fight, y'all. Everybody take care and have a good night. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.